An infertile rancher found an injured woman and 6 kids sleeping in his barn. What he did next shocked the whole town. The prairie lay hushed beneath a winter-thin moon, every fence post drawn long across the frostbitten earth like weary shadows. Wind moved through the cottonwoods with a whispering sound, as if the land itself was sighing after another day of toil. Ryan Watson guided his horse along the lane that led home, his shoulders stooped from hours bent over a stubborn windmill gear. The lantern tied to his saddle swayed with each step of the mare, sending brief flares of gold across the field stubble, then letting the darkness fold back over him. He longed for the small comfort of his own hearth, the taste of beans left warming on the stove, and the simple relief of laying his bones down. Yet as he drew near the barn, a sound lifted out of the stillness, faint but sharp enough to stop him mid-stride. It was no coyote cry nor the restless lowing of cattle. It was the rough scrape of a cough, high-pitched, small, too fragile to belong to any grown man. He froze, hand resting on the rifle strap across his chest, listening. The cough came again, muffled, followed by a quick rustle, the kind that suggested a cluster of bodies shifting together in secret. Ryan tethered the mare to the fence and moved with deliberate steps toward the barn doors. They were closed only part way, as though someone had slipped through and not troubled to fasten the latch. He pressed his palm against the wood and pushed, and the smell of hay, animal warmth, and something else, fear sharp as iron, drifted out. Inside, the lantern light revealed motes of dust circling like pale snowflakes. He held the flame higher, and the sight arrested him. A woman crouched against the oat bin, her body curved in a shield around a tangle of children. Her hair was dark with dust, a strand plastered to her cheek, and her eyes caught the light with the fierce glimmer of someone cornered. The children huddled so close their knees overlapped, their small faces half buried in her skirts, eyes wide as coins. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She simply braced herself, chin lifted, as if ready to take whatever storm was about to break over them. Ryan's voice came slow, careful, stripped of threat. "I don't aim to harm you." His words hung soft in the hay-scented air, and he watched the tremor in her shoulders ease, though she did not move from her guard. The children's cough stirred again. Ryan lowered the lantern a little, letting the glow fall gently across their faces. He saw dirt smudges, lips cracked from thirst, eyes ringed with weariness that no child ought to know. The woman pressed her hand against her ribs as if each breath cost her dear, but she whispered, almost inaudibly, their names. Eli, Nora, Caleb, Ruthie, Josie, Each name struck him like a hammer finding a bell. 6 in all. She said them like a prayer, one after the other, clinging to syllables as though they alone could keep the little ones alive. Ryan repeated them quietly under his breath, tasting them as though committing them to memory was his first duty. The eldest boy, Eli, perhaps 12, lifted his chin and stared with a defiance too old for his small frame. Nora, just behind him, hugged the youngest to her chest. Little Tom, no more than 4, his eyes heavy-lidded but curious. Caleb and Ruthie leaned together, sharing the weight of exhaustion, while Josie, 6, burrowed her face into the woman's arm. The woman's voice cracked as she gave her own name at last. Lila May Hollander. Her tone carried no plea, only a quiet dignity, as if she expected nothing but rejection and preferred it spoken quickly. Ryan lowered the lantern to a beam near the straw, setting it firm. He crouched, resting one hand on his knee, and studied her with the steady patience of a man who knew words were sometimes less than silence. He saw the bruise along her temple, the crude wrapping at her wrist, the fraying hem of a skirt mended so many times it was more thread than cloth. He saw hunger plain in the hollows of the children's cheeks. She did not offer explanation, yet fragments surfaced in her tone. A wagon lost for debt. A sister buried under cottonwoods, earth not yet settled over the grave. Children gathered not only of her body but of her heart, left behind, given up, or otherwise orphaned. She had taken them all, for the world seemed bent on scattering them. She had gathered them as one might gather wind-blown seeds, refusing to let them drift away. Ryan listened, and as he listened, something stirred in him, quiet but insistent. He, too, knew the ache of being deemed less than whole. Years ago, a fevered winter had stolen more than his strength. The doctor had spoken plain. No child would ever come of his line. Since then he had borne the whispers in the saloon, The side-eyed looks of neighbors who said a man unable to leave heirs was a man incomplete. He had learned to keep his silence, to let his work on the land speak in his stead. But the hollowness remained, a vacant room in the house of his soul. Now, before him, 6 children breathed in the straw-scented dark, and their weary mother pressed them close with the desperation of a hawk shielding her young. And Ryan felt that hollow space within him shift. Outside, dawn began its slow gray creep across the sky. The barn timbers caught the first slivers of light, cool and merciless. A sharp clatter broke the stillness. Boots on gravel, a voice calling his name. James Cutter appeared at the barn door, his hat cocked neat, his coat buttoned, his face clean-shaven as always. He looked first to Ryan, then to the huddled figures by the oat bin, his mouth curving into something between triumph and disdain. "So, this is what you've dragged home," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "A woman with 6 hungry mouths. The town won't thank you for feeding strangers." Lila stiffened, the children shrinking against her. Ryan rose to his full height, the lantern light catching the square lines of his jaw. He answered not with argument but with action. He took a loaf of bread from the shelf, broke it in halves, and set it upon the floor near Lila's side. He drew quilts from the loft, shook them out, and laid them across the straw. He filled a basin from the pump and placed it within reach. "These are calves," he said evenly, his eyes fixed on James. "Calves, and they'll grow strong if tended right." James gave a brittle laugh, tipping his hat as if to dismiss the scene. He muttered something about fools and mercy costing more than coin, then turned back toward town, his boots ringing sharp against the frozen ground. Lila's eyes met Ryan's then, searching for the snare hidden in his kindness. Yet all she found was the calm patience of a man who offered without demand. As the barn settled again into quiet, another figure appeared, Widow Temperance Crow, her gray hair bound tight, her hands carrying both a satchel and the weight of decades spent patching wounds no one else would touch. She stepped close, squinting at Lila's face, at the bound wrist, at the trembling children. Without ceremony she unwrapped the crude binding, applied a cleaner cloth, and pressed a small loaf into Eli's hands. Her eyes flicked to Ryan with a knowledge older than either of them. "You've taken a burden," she seemed to say, "and a blessing too." When she left, the barn seemed warmer for her passing. The children ate in silence, crumbs scattering like hope across the straw. Tom, the youngest, curled against Ryan's coat where it lay spread over him, the tiny sound of his breathing deepening into sleep. Ryan remained standing a while, memorizing the sounds of this makeshift family, the rustle of quilts, the small sighs, the steadying rhythm of Lila's breath as she allowed herself, at last, to rest upright without guarding every moment. Outside, the cottonwood bell rope tapped against the church rim in the stirring wind, each soft knock echoing like a heart finding its beat again. Ryan closed his eyes and listened. Something was beginning here, though whether mercy or trial he could not yet say. But he knew with a certainty deeper than words that he could not send them away. And when dawn spilled fully across the land, the town would see, and the judgment would come. The morning broke pale and cold, the frost holding to every rail and fence post like lace stitched overnight by unseen fingers. Ryan Watson rose before the sun, as he always did, though this time his steps held a different weight. The barn, once filled only with the breath of cattle, now held the softer chorus of children's sighs, the rustle of quilts, and the muffled sound of a woman turning gently so as not to wake them. He stood for a long moment at the threshold, his hat in hand, watching. The lantern he had left still smoldered its last wick of light, casting amber over small faces. The sight held him as firmly as any chain could. He did not speak at first. He let them wake in their own rhythm. Eli stretched, stiff in the straw, his jaw set in a line of practiced defiance. Nora carefully straightened her dress and smoothed her sister's hair before her own. Caleb blinked into the light as if it pained him, while Ruthie whispered something to Josie that made the little girl cover her mouth to stifle laughter. Tom clutched at the sleeve of Lila's bodice even in sleep, unwilling to release her even to dreams. When Lila finally rose, wincing at the pull in her ribs, Ryan stepped forward. He did not reach to steady her at the waist, though the instinct stirred in him. Instead, he offered his arm at the elbow, a gesture of respect that gave her the choice. She accepted, fingers light as a bird alighting on a branch, and together they moved into the clearer light of morning. The table inside Ryan's house had known only one place setting for too many years. Now it groaned under the weight of tin cups, chipped plates, and the uncertain shuffle of 7 new presences. He cut thick slices from a loaf and poured honey in a shallow dish, the golden ribbon catching the light. The children ate with quiet concentration, their hunger polite but insistent. Lila waited until they were fed, then reached for the last crust, tearing it carefully so each child received an even share. Eli, when he was finished, drew a small knife from his belt, the handle half-carved. He sat near the hearth, whittling with solemn care until a small, smooth piece took shape. It was the beginning of a handle, perhaps for a needle case. He glanced at Lila as he worked, and Ryan saw the wordless devotion there, the boy carving usefulness out of what little he had, as though proving himself man enough to protect her. Ryan's chest ached at the sight, for he recognized the same silent promise he had once tried to carry for his own mother before the earth took her. The day wore on, and necessity drove them toward town. The children's shoes were worn through, and Lila's shawl, though patched, could not hold back the bite of wind. Ryan hitched the wagon, and soon the road carried them all in a slow procession. 6 small boot scuffs on the planks, one woman seated upright though pain bent her frame, and Ryan at the reins, his jaw tight at the thought of eyes that would surely follow. Willow Bend was never shy about staring. As they entered the main street, heads turned, whispers rose, and the careful order of the town shifted, as it always did when something new disrupted the pattern. Lila sat tall, refusing to bow her head, but Ryan saw the flush of heat rise against the pallor of her cheeks. Children clung closer to one another, their bodies forming an instinctive wall against judgment. At the schoolhouse, Miss Pearl Daventry stood waiting with a slate in hand. Her hair, always pinned precisely, gleamed like copper in the sun. She crouched to meet the children's eyes, one by one, writing their names carefully in chalk as they spoke them. Each letter appeared slow and deliberate, the white dust lifting into the cold air like frost. When Josie whispered hers, too soft to carry, Miss Pearl leaned close and whispered it back to her, making the girl smile shyly. That small smile, fragile as glass, cracked something open in the watching crowd. Even those who had come to disapprove found their hearts tugged by it. But not all hearts were moved. Behind the feed store, James Cutter waited, his polished boots gleaming, his hat set just so. He gestured for Lila to step aside. She hesitated, but curiosity, or perhaps duty to hear, drew her to him. His words dripped honey but carried the sting of nettles. A woman alone, he said, was a storm waiting to flatten herself and anyone near her. He spoke of a room in his boarding house, clean and respectable. He promised her rest, a place to mend. Yet his bargain carried a hidden blade. He would take her in only if she signed papers with the orphan agent, releasing the younger 4 into official guardianship. Fewer mouths, fewer burdens, he said, would make her more acceptable in the eyes of the town. Lila returned from that shadowed awning pale as linen, her steps uneven. Ryan was waiting in the narrow alley, his frame filling it so she could not slip by without meeting his eyes. She spoke nothing at first, but he saw the tremble in her lip, the shame of even hearing the offer. He said only this: "No bargain is fair when it demands your empty hands." His voice was steady, carrying no judgment, only an assurance that her worth was not weighed by what she surrendered. The law's shadow touched them next. Deputy Ward Ketchum, broad-shouldered and plain of speech, stopped by the wagon as they prepared to leave town. "Trespass in your barn last night," he said, "could count against them. But mercy this morning counts more." He glanced at James, who lingered nearby with folded arms and a sour smile. "Best you quit your meddling, Cutter, unless you want scripture tested in public." The warning held weight, and James turned away, though not without a glare that promised the matter was not finished. Back at the ranch, the day took on a quieter rhythm. Eli learned to set fence posts beside Ryan, the boy's small arms straining but determined. Lila sat in the shade, sewing a curtain from scraps so the boys might have their own corner. Nora polished the lamp chimneys until they gleamed, and when evening came, their glow filled the house with warmth brighter than any lamp had shone in years. Widow Crow appeared again, this time with a pot of beans whose scent filled the room. She set them down without flourish, then sat back and watched as the bowls were filled, as children passed spoons, as Ryan took his place at the head but waited until all were served before he lifted his own. Her eyes, sharp yet kind, lingered longest on Ryan, watching him watch the children as though they were the horizon he had waited years to see. She said nothing, but when she rose to leave, her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a gesture that carried both blessing and burden. As night settled, Ryan fetched another board from the shed and fixed it across the table, lengthening it so 8 bowls could sit without crowding. The hammer's ring echoed softly in the lamplight, a sound more sacred than any hymn. When the work was done, he bowed his head, whispering a farmer's grace in the plain language of the land. Thanks for bread, for breath, for hands that mend. The children, uncertain, watched Lila, and when she folded her hands, so did they. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a murmur of storm yet to come. Outside, the cottonwood swayed, their branches scratching at the sky. Inside, the air was warm with beans, bread, and the fragile sense of belonging. Yet even in that moment of stillness, Ryan felt the weight of what lay ahead. Mercy, once given, cannot be withdrawn without breaking something sacred. The town would not leave them be. James would circle again, and others with him, armed not with rifles but with gossip, law, and the sharpened edges of expectation. Ryan looked at Lila, her face softened in the lamplight though her eyes remained watchful. He knew she was waiting for the moment kindness turned into cost. He laid his hands flat against the table, feeling the grain beneath his palms. The second board, freshly nailed, seemed to pulse with meaning. It was no longer a table for one, nor even two. It was a table that demanded courage enough to keep it filled. As the thunder muttered again across the horizon, Ryan lifted his gaze. In the reflection of the lamplight against the window, he saw not only himself but the outline of 7 others gathered close. A family, if only the world would let them remain so. And in that reflection, for the first time, he allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous thought, that perhaps they already were. Rain came in the night, slow at first, then harder, drumming on the roof like 1,000 fingers tapping out a hymn older than language. By morning, the storm had thinned to a steady curtain, silvering the air, filling every hollow with a smell sharp as wet iron. The house darkened under it, lamplight burning faint even at midday, and the children lay scattered across quilts, their small breaths rising and falling like waves on a quiet shore. Ryan Watson sat at the table, ledger open before him, though his eyes barely scanned the rows of figures. His ears stayed tuned to the rhythm of rain against the eaves, his heart to the sound of Lila May's voice where she sat sewing near the hearth. Her fingers moved slow, careful, mending a shirt whose elbows had nearly given way. Each tug of thread seemed to steady her, yet Ryan saw the fatigue etched in the corners of her mouth, the way her eyes sometimes drifted not to her work but to the sleeping children, as though counting them again to be sure none had slipped away. By afternoon the clouds broke slightly, a paler light seeping through. Ryan stood, pulling on his coat, and glanced toward the door. He meant to step out only briefly, to check the fence line where runoff might have loosened the soil. But when he turned, Lila rose also, setting aside her needle. Her lips parted as though to ask permission, yet she said nothing, only waited. He nodded, and she followed him out into the wet air. They walked together beneath the cottonwood that stood tall behind the barn, its trunk wide enough to bear the marks of storms long past. Rain still slid down its bark, darkening the grooves, dripping steadily onto the roots. Lila leaned one hand against the tree, the other pressed lightly to her ribs. She looked up at the branches, then back at Ryan, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a question long kept. "What kind of home does a man keep," she asked, "when the cradle stays empty?" The words stilled the air around them, sharper than any wind. Ryan felt them cut into the marrow of his bones, for they named the hollow he had carried since the fever years. He swallowed, the rain dripping from his hat brim to the mud at his feet. His voice came low, stripped of all defense. "Illness," he said. "A winter that near took me. When I rose again, the doctor told me plain. No child would come of me. Men in the saloon made their jokes. I let them. But I reckon a man's measured by bread he puts on a table, not by blood he spills into the world." Lila's eyes held his, steady and searching. She did not flinch at his confession, nor soften it with pity. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the tree, her fingers tracing the damp bark as if reading a story in its lines. When she spoke again, her voice trembled only slightly. "I've carried 6 children," she said, "but not all from my own body. 2 were my sisters before she went under the cottonwoods. One I found waiting at a depot bench, left with nothing but a name scrawled on a tag. Another came from a neighbor too beaten to keep him. They are mine because I would not let the world scatter them. Yet still I hear the whispers. Greedy for love, they say. Foolish to claim so many. She paused, her breath visible in the cool damp. What frightens me most is not hunger nor bruises, but the day someone will tear them from me because I am not enough to keep them. Ryan's chest tightened at her words. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to adjust the cottonwood's bell rope, which hung low from a branch, frayed at the end. He tied a knot, lowering it further, then lifted Tom, the smallest, who had toddled out unnoticed, clutching his blanket. The boy's tiny fingers grasped the rope, and Ryan guided them, helping him tug. The bell clanged once, deep and resonant, rolling across the wet fields like a call to something larger than themselves. The rain seemed to soften with its sound, as though even the storm bent to listen. For a moment, no words passed between them. The truth had been laid bare, his barrenness, her fear, their shared ache of being judged by what the world said they lacked. In that silence, something else stirred, something that needed no explanation. It was as if both had stepped across a threshold without speaking of it, bound by the knowledge of each other's wounds. By evening, the schoolteacher came to the ranch, her skirts soaked to the knees, her hair undone from the storm. Miss Pearl carried papers, their edges curled by damp. She explained breathlessly that James Cutter had already spoken to the orphan agent, pressing that the younger children should be placed on the next train east. Unless Lila signed guardianship forms within the week, the matter might be taken from her altogether. The words struck like a hammer blow. Lila's hands trembled as she accepted the papers, her eyes scanning the harsh lines of print. Josie clung to her skirts, sensing the fear beneath her calm. Miss Pearl's eyes were kind, but the urgency in them could not be denied. She left the papers on the table, urging them to decide quickly, before Cutter tightened his grip. That night, Ryan did not eat. He stood by the window long after the children slept, staring out at the cottonwood where rain still clung to the branches like beads of glass. His ledger lay open on the table, blank page ready, yet he had written nothing. At last, he sat, pencil in hand. Slowly, he began to write the children's names, one by one, in the same careful script he used for cattle tallies. Eli, Nora, Caleb, Ruthie, Josie, Tom. He wrote them under the column marked assets, then crossed it out, shaking his head. He turned the page, tried again, this time writing them beneath a heading he scrawled anew, heirs. His hand trembled, but he pressed on, each name darkening the paper like a seed planted in soil. When he reached the end, he paused, staring at the list. Something still felt unfinished. He set the pencil down, and from between the ledger's pages drew a pressed wildflower he had kept since boyhood, faded but intact. He laid it across the names, closing the book gently, as though tucking the promise within. In the shadows of the room, Lila stirred from her place near the hearth, watching him without speaking. She saw the care in his movements, the reverence with which he handled the names, and though no vow passed his lips, she felt it settle deep in her bones. This man meant to stand between them and the storm. The next day, Ryan made his way to Widow Crow's cabin, his boots sinking in the soft earth. He carried the ledger beneath his arm, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. The old woman opened her door before he knocked, as if expecting him. He laid the book on her table, spoke in few words of Cutter's scheming, of the orphan agent, of the children's uncertain claim to safety. Widow Crow's eyes narrowed, then softened as she read the names, her weathered fingers brushing the faded flower. She nodded once, a gesture both grave and approving. When he left, the rain had ceased, and the cottonwood stood bright against a clearing sky. The bell rope swayed lightly, though no hand touched it, as if some unseen force tested its strength. That night, as lamplight flickered and the children drifted into sleep, Lila caught sight of Ryan's ledger open once more. This time, the names were not written in columns but spread across a sketch of the land itself. Small parcels marked out, each bearing one of the children's names. The creek bend, the cottonwood shade, a strip near the school fence. She pressed her hand to her mouth, overcome by the enormity of what he planned. She turned to him, her eyes wide. "You would give them land?" she whispered. His answer was quiet, almost a prayer. Bread feeds a day. Land feeds a life. Her throat tightened. She had braced herself for bargains, for demands, for kindness that always carried cost. But here stood a man who offered not because of what he lacked, but because of what he could still give. She felt tears rise, hot against her cheeks, though she tried to hide them. Ryan did not reach to wipe them away. He only stood, steady as ever, allowing her the dignity of her sorrow. And in that restraint, she felt more seen than she had in all her years of struggle. Outside, the cottonwood's branches swayed, their leaves whispering in the night. The bell rope knocked gently against the trunk, a muted echo, like a promise waiting to be spoken aloud. And though neither of them said the word, both knew it lingered there between them, fragile but unbreakable, family. Yet even as that truth settled in the quiet, a knock came at the door, sharp, insistent, carrying the weight of what lay beyond. Sunday dawned sharp as a blade, light slicing through the clouds and striking the white boards of the church until they gleamed almost painfully bright. The bell rope swayed against its beam as though restless, waiting to be pulled. The town of Willow Bend stirred early, drawn not only by him and habit but by rumor that something unusual would unfold within those walls. Boots clattered on steps, shawls were pulled close, whispers rose like sparrows startled from a field. Ryan Watson arrived not in haste but in steady silence, hat brim low, ledger held beneath his arm. Lila walked beside him, her wrist still bandaged, her face pale but calm. The children came in 2 rows, hand in hand, their clothes freshly mended though still worn thin. Eli carried Tom on his hip, the boy's small head resting against a shoulder, while Nora guided Josie, whispering encouragement into her ear. They moved as one body, though the eyes of the town picked at them like crows. James Cutter stood near the church steps, the orphan agent beside him with papers tucked into a leather folio. James's smile was sharp, thin as a knife. He greeted passers-by with a tilt of his hat. His words dipped in syrup, but his gaze never left Lila and the children. His satisfaction hung about him like perfume. Here, at last, he believed the law and the town's propriety would undo them. Inside, the pews filled quickly, the air close with the mingled scents of lamp oil and pressed wool. Reverend Boone stood at the pulpit, his hands resting on the worn edges of the great Bible, his voice rising in prayer that fell heavy with the weight of expectation. But before he could begin the hymn, Ryan stepped forward, setting the ledger on the small table that served as the church's lectern. The sound of it struck the room like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations faltered, heads turned, eyes narrowed. Ryan's voice came low at first, then gathered strength, not from volume but from the steady cadence of a man who meant every word. He began not with argument nor excuse, but with names. One by one, he read them aloud: Eli, Nora, Caleb, Ruthie, Josie, Tom, his tone reverent, as if speaking them stitched something sacred into the walls themselves. The children sat straighter as their names filled the air, the syllables claimed publicly, no longer whispers in a barn but banners unfurled in the house of God. When he finished, he opened the ledger. Instead of cattle tallies, the pages bore sketches of land parcels, each marked with one of those names. The creek strip, the cottonwood shade, the field by the school fence. He laid folded deeds beside the book, rough papers but signed proper. His voice did not waver as he declared that these children were to be his heirs, not in blood but in bread, not in seed but in shelter. He asked Reverend Boone to witness the transfer that day, before the eyes of all. A murmur swept the pews, shock rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Widow Crow leaned forward, eyes sharp with approval, her lips curved in something close to a smile. Miss Pearl gripped the pew rail, tears brightening her eyes, the chalk dust of those names still lingering in her memory. Even Deputy Ketchum, usually stone-faced, gave a short nod, as if to say the law had nothing to protest here. James Cutter rose from his seat in the front, his voice slick but edged with steel. "This is folly," he said, his gaze darting between the Reverend and the orphan agent. "You cannot make heirs of children not your own with a ledger and a pencil. The law demands order. These little ones belong where the state places them, not in the hands of a barren man clinging to sentiment." His words cut cruelly, aimed at Ryan's old wound. The room held its breath, waiting for the sting to break him. But Ryan did not flinch. He turned his gaze on James, calm and steady. "A man is barren only if his heart is empty," he said, "and mine is not." He stepped closer to the pulpit, his frame filling the space with quiet strength. "Land is mine to give, bread is mine to break, and by these children's names I swear it will be so." His voice did not rise, but it carried, heavy with truth that silenced the murmurs. The orphan agent shuffled, uneasy, riffling through his folio. But Deputy Ketchum spoke before he could. "Deeds signed proper hold weight," he said flatly. "And guardianship, witnessed by Reverend Boone, carries standing enough. If Cutter wishes to press further, he'll need a judge, and none within 3 counties would waste time against land set aside clean." His words landed like a hammer sealing a nail. James's smile faltered, his face tightening as he realized the ground had shifted beneath him. Lila stepped forward then, her hand trembling slightly as she laid it atop the ledger. She lifted her chin, showing the bruise still faint along her temple, the bandage on her wrist. She spoke softly, but the hush in the room gave her voice power. "I will stay," she said. "I will mend, I will teach, I will work beside him. These children are mine, by love if not by law. If anyone seeks to tear them from me, they must take me also." The children rose at her side, pressing close, their small bodies forming a wall stronger than any stone. For a moment the church seemed to sway with the weight of it, silence heavy as storm air. Then, slowly, Reverend Boone closed the great Bible, his voice low but firm. "What God joins, let no man put asunder." He reached for the deeds, signing them with his trembling hand. Widow Crow added her name next, then Miss Pearl, then Deputy Ketchum, each stroke of ink binding the promise tighter. The church bell pealed suddenly, a deep rolling sound that filled every corner of Willow Bend. Heads turned in surprise, for no hand had been seen pulling the rope. But when the eyes found the source, they saw Tom, the youngest, lifted by Ryan, his small hands gripping the lowered knot. His laughter rang with the bell, pure and unafraid, echoing down the street like rain after a long drought. The sound loosened something in the hearts of those who heard it, scattering doubts like leaves. James Cutter sank back into his pew, his face pale with defeat. The orphan agent closed his folio, murmuring that his work here was done. One by one, the townsfolk rose, some in silence, some in soft applause, until the church itself seemed to breathe with the force of a new beginning. When the bells stilled, Ryan turned to Lila. He did not kneel, nor produce a ring. Instead, he drew from his pocket a simple iron key tied with a strip of red ribbon. He held it out to her, his voice steady but tender. "This opens the porch door," he said. "I would have it in your hands, if you'll keep it." Her breath caught, tears shimmering in her eyes as she accepted it. She did not speak at once, but the way her fingers closed over the key told all. The children pressed around them, faces alight with a joy they had not dared before. For the first time, they did not look like wanderers gathered in desperation. They looked like a family, stitched together not by blood but by choice, by mercy that shocked the whole town into silence. Outside, the cottonwood branches shivered in the breeze, their leaves catching the sunlight now breaking free of clouds. The rope hung low, still tied in the child's knot, swaying gently, a promise that every hand, no matter how small, had the power to wring it. And in that moment, as the bell's echo faded, it seemed to Ryan, and perhaps to all who watched, that the land itself had bent to witness. That some truths, once spoken, cannot be silenced. That family is not measured by the cradle nor by the seed, but by the courage to stand and say, "These are mine, and I am theirs." Old voices would carry that story long after, told in lamplight and whispered on porches. But for those who saw it that day, it was more than tale. It was proof that mercy, once given, can remake the world. And if you are listening now, carry this truth with you. The measure of a life is not in what you keep, but in what you dare to give away. Before you go, leave a little warmth behind. Like and subscribe so these stories keep riding your way. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, for every hearth is brighter when another voice joins the circle.